A drone captures a reflection in the river. It solves a 15-year-old missing case. The drone, a high-end quadcopter he'd named Icarus in a fit of classical irony, hummed a low, insistent thrum against the quiet of the Oregon woods. Leo sat on the damp tailgate of his Ford Ranger, the controller warm in his hands, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen of the connected iPad. This was his escape. Not from anything so dramatic as a bad marriage or a crippling debt, but from the relentless, beige-colored boredom of his life. He sold enterprise software solutions. He had a mortgage. He was 34 and felt the icy grip of a future that looked exactly like his present. So, he flew. He sent Icarus soaring over the dense canopy of Douglas firs, the camera tilting down to catch the late afternoon sun glinting off the Clackamas River. The water, swollen with spring melt, was the color of weak tea, churning and fast. He was searching for nothing in particular: a majestic shot of a bald eagle, the fleeting shadow of a deer at the water's edge, anything to break the monotony. He'd been coming to this same secluded spot for months, a bend in the river miles from any official park or trail, accessible only by a series of crumbling logging roads. It was his private cathedral of green and gray. He brought the drone down low, skimming just feet above the river's surface, a maneuver that always made his heart hammer against his ribs. The thrill was in the risk, the proximity to disaster. The camera, a state-of-the-art Hasselblad, captured the chaotic dance of the current in stunning 4K. He saw every ripple, every piece of driftwood caught in an eddy, every bubble that broke the surface. He was so focused on the technical perfection of the shot, on the smooth cinematic sweep he was executing, that he almost missed it. It was a flicker, a distortion in the water's reflection. Not a fish, not a trick of the light. It was something geometric, something out of place. His thumbs froze on the joysticks. He hovered Icarus, letting the drone hold its position with GPS precision. He zoomed in, the digital magnification degrading the image slightly, but not enough to obscure the shape. It was a face. Pale, distorted by the moving water, but unmistakably a human face. Looking up at him from beneath the surface, Leo's breath hitched. His first thought was that it was a mannequin, a prank, some grotesque piece of litter dumped in the wilderness, but the eyes, even through the murky water and the digital screen, they seemed to hold a silent, pleading horror. The mouth was open, a dark O of surprise or a final, unheard scream. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine, a primal fear that had nothing to do with the thrill of flying and everything to do with the sudden, brutal intrusion of death into his carefully curated solitude. He had to be sure. He was a logical man. He sold software solutions by appealing to reason and efficiency. Panic was an unproductive state. He took a shaky breath and initiated the drone's recording function. The small red dot on his screen, a confirmation that this nightmare was now being documented. He maneuvered Icarus with painstaking slowness, trying to get a clearer angle, fighting the glare of the sun on the water. The reflection of the drone itself, a four-armed cross, passed over the submerged face like a final mechanical blessing. The body, because he now accepted that it was a body, was wedged between two large moss-covered rocks just below a small cascade. The current pulled at the figure's long dark hair, making it wave like seaweed. The clothes were tattered, blending in with the riverbed's detritus of leaves and silt. It was the face that was so stark, so shockingly white against the rivers. Gloom. Who was she? How long had she been here? His mind, trained to solve problems, raced through a flowchart of possibilities. A hiker who fell, a suicide. But this place was so remote, no one came here. He hadn't seen another soul in all the months he'd been flying his drone in this forgotten corner of the forest. A wave of nausea washed over him. He was the one who had found her. This discovery was his now, a terrible, unwanted ownership. The quiet woods no longer felt like a sanctuary. They felt like a tomb. The hum of the drone, once a sound of freedom, now seemed like the buzz of a carrion fly. He knew what he had to do. He had to call the police. He had to land the drone, pack up his gear, and drive back towards the weak signal of civilization. But he hesitated. He kept the drone hovering, the lens fixed on the submerged face. Something held him there. It was a morbid curiosity, yes, but something more. It was the feeling that he was looking at something that had been deliberately hidden, not just lost to accident. The way the body was wedged, almost anchored, between the rocks. It didn't look natural. He needed more than just a single, blurry shot. He needed proof that couldn't be dismissed. He brought Icarus in even closer, the rotors whipping the water's surface, creating a small vortex that momentarily cleared. The view for a heart-stopping second, the water was almost clear. He saw a flash of metal on the figure's hand, a ring, and something else. A dark shape near the throat, a necklace, or a bruise, a mark of violence. The drone's battery warning beeped, a shrill, electronic intrusion. 20% remaining. He had to land soon. He pulled back on the joystick, lifting Icarus away from the water, away from the dead girl in the river. As the drone ascended, the camera tilted down for one last, wide shot. From this higher vantage point, he saw the scene in its entirety. The churning river, the dark firs, the mossy rocks, and he saw something else, something he had completely missed from the ground. On the riverbank, not 20 feet from where the body was submerged, half hidden by ferns and a fallen log, was a patch of disturbed earth. It wasn't just a deer trail or the result of erosion. It was a clearing, an unnatural clearing, and in the center of it, almost completely overgrown, but still visible if you knew what to look for, was the faint rectangular outline of a shallow grave. Up the battery alarm screamed now, a continuous, frantic pulse. 10%, he had to bring it down, but his eyes were glued to the screen, to the impossible geometry of that disturbed patch of earth. A grave, an empty grave. His blood ran cold. The body wasn't meant to be in the river. The river was an accident, a secondary crime scene. The real crime had happened on the bank. Someone had brought her here, dug a grave, and then what? Something had gone wrong with their plan. The river had taken her before the earth could. He finally broke the trance. His thumbs moving with frantic energy to bring the drone home. He landed it clumsily on the tailgate. The rotor spinning down with a final, sighing whir. He snatched the iPad, his fingers trembling as he replayed the last few seconds of the video. There it was, unmistakable. A grave. He felt a new kind of fear now, sharp and immediate. The person who did this, who dug that grave, they knew this place. This remote, hidden, secret place, his place. How many times had he sat here, in this exact spot, lost in his own world, while this horror lay just a few feet away? Had the killer ever come back? To check on his work? To make sure his secret was safe? Leo scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting into the darkening woods around him. Every shadow seemed to take on a human form. Every rustle of leaves was a footstep. The sun was dipping below the tree line, casting long menacing fingers of darkness across the forest floor. He was alone, miles from anywhere, with a dead body in the river and an empty grave on the bank. And the chilling realization that the killer could be anywhere. He could be watching him right now. He threw the drone and the controller into the cab of his truck, not bothering to pack them properly. He slammed the door, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, shattering the unholy quiet. He didn't turn on his headlights. He didn't want to announce his departure. He just wanted to disappear. He slammed the truck into drive, the tires spinning in the mud before finding purchase. He careened down the logging road, the truck bouncing violently over ruts and rocks. He didn't slow down. He didn't dare. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a pair of headlights emerge from the darkness behind him. The image of the face in the water was burned into his mind. A ghostly afterimage on his retina. The open mouth, the pleading eyes, and the empty grave, a dark rectangular wound in the earth. He had stumbled upon the end of a story that had ended in this cold, lonely place. But as he sped away, a new and terrifying thought began to form in his mind. He hadn't just found the end of a story. He had found the beginning of his own. And he was driving away from the crime scene with the only evidence, the only proof of what he had seen, stored on a tiny memory card in a drone he had named after a boy who flew too close to the sun. He had the footage, he had the face, and he had the chilling, absolute certainty that he was now part of something terrible, something that had been waiting in the cold, dark water for 15 long years to be found. The cliffhanger wasn't just in the woods. It was in his passenger seat, a silent, digital ghost he was now responsible for. He had captured a reflection, and in doing so, he had shattered the quiet surface of his own life. The ripples were just beginning to spread. The Clackamas County Sheriff's Office was a low brick building that smelled of stale coffee and institutional despair. Detective Frank Miller, a man whose face seemed to be permanently fixed in a state of weary resignation, looked at Leo as if he were a particularly uninteresting species of insect. Miller was 2 years from retirement, and his patience for anything that threatened to complicate his final stretch had long since evaporated. He had a gut that strained the buttons of his plaid shirt and a mustache that looked like it had given up trying to be anything other than a grey, bristly smudge. "A drone, you said?" Miller asked, his voice a gravelly monotone. He took a long, slow sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving Leo's. "Yes, I was flying it over the river, for photography," Leo explained, his own voice sounding thin and reedy in the sterile interrogation room. He'd been sitting there for over an hour, the adrenaline of his flight from the woods having long since curdled into a sick, anxious dread. "Photography," Miller repeated, the word tasting like an accusation. "Uh-huh. And you found a body?" "In the water, yes, and a grave, an empty grave on the bank." Miller set his mug down with a heavy thud. He leaned forward, the chair groaning in protest. "Mr. Davies, do you know how many I think I saw a body calls we get? Especially from folks with new toys. We get calls about Bigfoot, UFOs, you name it. A lot of the time, it turns out to be a log, or a deer carcass, or just too much. Damn imagination." "This wasn't my imagination," Leo insisted, leaning forward as well, his hands flat on the cold metal table. "I have it on video. I showed your deputy at the front desk. It's clear as day." "We're looking at it," Miller said, waving a dismissive hand. "But the location you gave us, that's way out in the sticks. It'll take my guys a while to get a team out there, especially with the light fading." "You're sure about this spot?" "I'm positive. I can take you there." "No, you'll stay right here for now," Miller said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He looked at Leo, a flicker of something not quite suspicion, but a deep, ingrained cynicism in his eyes. "Tell me again, Mr. Davies, what were you doing out there? All alone, miles from nowhere?" "I told you, I'm a photographer, a hobbyist. I like the solitude." "The solitude," Miller mused, stroking his mustache. "You find a lot of dead girls in the solitude." The question hit Leo like a slap. "Of course not. This is the first time. I mean, I've never found anything like this before. And you just happened to be flying your little toy right over her." "It wasn't a toy. It's a professional-grade drone." And yes, it was. A coincidence, an accident. "There are no accidents, Mr. Davies," Miller said, his voice dropping low. "Not when it comes to a body in the water. There's only what people do and what people find, and right now, you're the one who did the finding." The door opened and a younger, uniformed officer leaned in. "Frank, you need to see this." Miller heaved himself out of his chair and followed the officer out, leaving Leo alone in the suffocating silence of the room. He stared at his own reflection in the one-way mirror, a pale, haunted version of the man who had driven into the woods that afternoon, seeking a little bit of beauty. He had found something else entirely. When Miller returned, his face was different. The weary resignation was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. The cynicism was still there, but it was now aimed at a target Leo couldn't see. "The girl in your video," Miller said, his voice clipped and precise. "We ran a facial recognition query against the state's missing persons database. We got a hit." Leo's heart hammered. "Who is she?" Miller slid a laminated piece of paper across the table. It was a missing person flyer, faded and dated. The photo showed a teenage girl with a bright, hopeful smile and dark, intelligent eyes. She had a spray of freckles across her nose and her hair was tied back in a ponytail. She looked vibrant, alive, full of a future that Leo knew she never got to have. Her name was Amelia Blackwood. Miller said, his voice softer now, tinged with a long dormant sadness. She was 17 years old. She went missing 15 years ago. 15 years. The number hung in the air, heavy and impossible. The girl in the river, the face in his drone footage, was a ghost from a forgotten headline. She disappeared from a party up in the hills, not 5 miles from where you found her, Miller continued, his eyes fixed on Leo's. We searched for months. Volunteers, dogs, helicopters. We combed every inch of that forest. We found nothing. Not a shoe, not a thread, not a single goddamn clue. It was like she just vanished off the face of the earth. Leo stared at the picture of Amelia Blackwood. Her smile was a punch to the gut. She was the same age as his own younger sister. He thought of all the moments that had passed in those 15 years. Graduations, holidays, heartbreaks, joys, an entire lifetime that this girl had been denied, while she lay silent and waiting in the cold, dark water. The case went cold a long time ago, Miller said, his voice a low rumble. Her parents moved away. The lead detective retired. People forgot, but I didn't. I was a rookie back then. It was my first big case. He looked down at his hands, his thick fingers tracing the rim of his coffee mug. We interviewed dozens of people, her friends, her boyfriend, the kids at the party. We had a suspect, of course. There's always a suspect. Who? Leo asked, his voice barely a whisper. Miller's eyes met his, and they were as cold and hard as river stones. Her boyfriend, a local kid named Ethan Hayes. He was older, a bit of a bad boy. He claimed he'd had a fight with her that night, and she'd walked off into the woods to cool down. Said he waited, but she never came back. His story was full of holes, but we could never prove it. No body, no crime scene, no case. Miller leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. Until now, you, Mr. Davies, with your little toy drone. You just found our crime scene. You just found Amelia Blackwood. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. And you just reopened a 15-year-old murder case. The room felt like it was shrinking, the air thick and hard to breathe. Leo looked from the smiling face of the dead girl to the grim, determined face of the detective. He was no longer just a hobbyist who had stumbled upon a tragedy. He was a witness. The witness, the one who held the key. The drone footage on his memory card wasn't just a record of a discovery. It was the first piece of evidence in a murder investigation that had been frozen in time. And the man who had put Amelia Blackwood in that shallow grave, the man who had been free for 15 years, was about to find out that his secret was no longer safe. The reflection in the river had brought it all back to the surface. And Frank Miller was a man who did not believe in letting things sink back into the darkness. The hunt was on. Amelia Blackwood was a girl made of sunlight and defiance. At 17, she vibrated with an energy that was both captivating and dangerous. She had her father's sharp intellect and her mother's artistic soul. A combination that made her restless in the small, suffocating town of Eagle Creek. She painted canvases that were too abstract for the local art fairs, wrote poems that were too raw for the school literary magazine, and argued with a ferocity that left her teachers both impressed and exhausted. Her smile, the one captured on the missing person flyer, was genuine, but it hid a deep and aching desire to be somewhere else, to be someone else. She felt like a star burning too brightly for the small constellation of her life. Her parents, David and Sarah Blackwood, adored her, but they didn't always understand her. David was a history professor at the local community college, a man who found comfort in the clear linear progression of the past. He wanted Amelia to follow a safe, predictable path. Good grades, a state university, a sensible career. Sarah, a potter who worked from a studio in their garage, understood Amelia's creative fire, but feared where it might lead her. She saw the same untamable spirit in her daughter that she had fought to suppress in herself for years, and it terrified her. Their love for Amelia was a constant, gentle pressure to conform, to be safe, to be smaller than she was meant to be. Their home was a place of quiet intellectualism and unspoken anxieties. Books lined every wall. The air smelled of clay and turpentine, and conversations often revolved around historical events or artistic theory. It was a loving home, but it was also a cage, and Amelia was rattling the bars. She dreamed of New York, of a life filled with art galleries and poetry slams, and people who understood that her intensity was a gift, not a problem. This yearning for escape was a secret she kept tucked away in the pages of her journal, a leather-bound book she kept hidden under a loose floorboard in her bedroom. Her journal was her only true confidant. In it, she poured out her frustrations with her parents, her dreams of the future, and her complicated, all-consuming feelings for Ethan Hayes. Ethan was her rebellion. He was 23 years older, and he represented everything her parents feared. He didn't read books, he rebuilt engines. He didn't talk about art, he had tattoos snaking up his arms. He had dropped out of high school and worked odd jobs, fixing cars at a local garage, his hands permanently stained with grease. To David and Sarah, he was the personification of a dead-end street. To Amelia, he was freedom. He was the first person who didn't try to change her. He seemed to revel in her fire, not fear it. When she talked about her art, he listened with a quiet intensity, his dark eyes fixed on her as if she were the most fascinating thing he had ever seen. He didn't pretend to understand the nuances of her paintings, but he understood the passion behind them. He would take her away from the quiet, book-lined streets of her neighborhood and drive her up into the mountains in his beat-up Chevy Nova, the windows down, the music blasting. With him, she felt seen. She felt alive. But there was a darkness in Ethan, a coiled anger that sometimes broke the surface. He had a possessive streak that she initially mistook for passion. He would get jealous if she talked to other boys, his jaw tightening, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. He hated her friends, who he called preppy little snobs, and he resented the time she spent on her schoolwork, seeing it as a world he couldn't enter. Their relationship was a cycle of intense highs and frightening lows. One day, he would surprise her with a wildflower he'd picked from the side of the road. The next, he would punch the dashboard of his car in a fit of rage because she was 5 minutes late to meet him. She told herself this was what real adult love was like. Messy, complicated, passionate. She wrote in her journal, "He's like a storm. I know I should run for cover, but I just want to stand in the rain." The hidden witness to this storm was Amelia's younger sister, Chloe, at 14. Chloe lived in Amelia's shadow, a quiet, observant moon to Amelia's blazing sun. She worshipped her older sister, idolized her talent, her courage, her beauty. She would sit in Amelia's room for hours, watching her paint, listening to her read her poetry aloud. Amelia was her hero, and she hated Ethan Hayes with a quiet, simmering intensity. Chloe saw what her parents couldn't, what Amelia wouldn't. She saw the way Ethan's hand would grip Amelia's arm just a little too tightly. She heard the cutting remarks he would make, disguised as jokes. She saw the flicker of fear in Amelia's eyes after one of their fights, a fear that Amelia would quickly hide behind a defiant smile. Chloe was the keeper of secrets. She knew about the journal under the floorboard. She knew that Amelia was saving money from her part-time job at the local bookstore, not for a new easel, but for a one-way bus ticket to New York. And she knew that the fights with Ethan were getting worse. A week before the party, Chloe was in her room, supposed to be doing her homework, when she heard them arguing in the driveway. She crept to her window and peered through the blinds. Ethan had Amelia backed up against his car. His face was contorted with rage, his voice a low, vicious snarl. "You think you're too good for me, don't you?" he spat. "With your fancy books and your big words, you think you can just run off to some big city and forget all about me. That's not it, Ethan." Amelia's voice was shaking, but she stood her ground. "I just need space. I need to figure out who I am, away from this town, away from everyone. You are who I say you are. He roared, and he slammed his fist into the car door, inches from her head. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. Amelia flinched, a small, involuntary movement that broke Chloe's heart. Chloe wanted to run out there, to scream at him, to pull her sister away, but she was frozen by fear. She was just a kid. He was a man, full of a terrifying, unpredictable violence. So she stayed behind the blinds, a silent, helpless witness, her heart pounding in her chest. The fight ended, as they always did, with Ethan's rage collapsing into a desperate, clinging remorse. He pulled Amelia into his arms, burying his face in her hair, whispering apologies, telling her he couldn't live without her, that he would die if she ever left him. And Amelia, trapped in that toxic cycle of abuse and affection, held him back. Her face a mask of confusion and exhaustion. Chloe saw it all, and she said nothing. She didn't tell her parents. She was afraid they would forbid Amelia from seeing Ethan, which would only make Amelia cling to him more tightly. And she didn't confront Amelia. She didn't know how. How do you tell your hero that you see the fear in her eyes? So she kept the secret, a heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. She watched her sister prepare for the party in the woods, the one Ethan was so insistent they attend. She watched Amelia put on her favorite silver necklace, a delicate chain with a small, crescent moon charm. She watched her put her journal in her bag, something she always did. And she watched her walk out the door to meet the boy who was like a storm, not knowing that this time, she wouldn't be coming back. Chloe's silence, born of fear and a misguided sense of loyalty, would become her own cage. One she would be trapped in for 15 long, agonizing years. The last time she saw her sister alive was through the slats of her blinds, a silhouette getting into a beat-up Chevy Nova, driving off into a darkness from which she would never return. The weeks following Amelia's disappearance were a blur of yellow police tape and whispered condolences. The Blackwood home, once a sanctuary of quiet intellectualism, became a command center for a search that grew more hopeless with each passing day. The smell of clay and turpentine was replaced by the cloying scent of casseroles brought by well-meaning neighbors. David and Sarah moved through their house like ghosts, their faces etched with a grief so profound it seemed to have physically aged them overnight. David, the man of logic and reason, tried to organize the search efforts, creating maps and timelines, clinging to the belief that the mystery could be solved if only they applied enough structure. Sarah, on the other hand, collapsed inward. She stopped going to her studio. The potter's wheel sat silent, draped in a dusty sheet, a monument to a joy that had been extinguished. Ethan Hayes was, from the beginning, Detective Frank Miller's only real suspect. In the initial interviews, his story was a cocktail of arrogance and feigned concern. He sat in the same sterile room Leo would occupy 15 years later, his leg bouncing with nervous energy, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding Miller's steady gaze. "We had a fight," he'd said, for the 10th time. "A stupid fight. About her wanting to go to college in New York. I told her it was a dumb idea, that she was just gonna get chewed up and spit out. She got mad, said I was trying to hold her back." His voice was laced with a self-pitying resentment. "So she just walked off into the woods in the middle of the night?" Miller had asked, his skepticism a palpable force in the room. "She was pissed. She does that. Goes for a walk to cool off. I figured she'd be back in an hour, or that she'd just walk home. It wasn't that far, but she didn't come back. And she didn't go home," Miller stated, his voice flat. "And you didn't go looking for her. You didn't call her parents. You just went home, and went to bed. I was drunk. I was pissed off. I passed out in my car for a while. When I woke up, it was almost dawn. I drove by her house, and her light wasn't on. I figured she was sleeping. I didn't know she was missing until her dad called me the next day." His story was thin, and his timeline was flimsy. He had scratches on his arms and neck, which he claimed were from working on an engine. He had fresh mud on his boots, which, he said, was from the party. He was arrogant, uncooperative, and radiated a sullen guilt. Miller knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that Ethan Hayes was lying. But knowing and proving were two different things. The police searched his Chevy Nova. They found a few of Amelia's hairs on the passenger seat, which was to be expected. They found a half-empty bottle of whiskey under the seat. But they found no blood, no signs of a struggle, no forensic evidence to tie him to her disappearance. They searched his small rented room above the garage where he worked. They found nothing. The injustice of it all was a slow-acting poison for the Blackwood family. They saw Ethan around town, driving his car, laughing with his friends, living his life while their daughter was gone. David, in a moment of raw desperation, confronted him in the parking lot of the grocery store. "Where is she, Ethan?" he had pleaded, his voice cracking, his academic composure shattered. "What did you do to her? Just tell us where she is. We just want to bring our daughter home." Ethan had just stared at him, his face a mask of cold indifference. "I don't know what you're talking about, old man," he'd said, before getting in his car and peeling out of the parking lot, leaving David standing there, a broken man. Amidst the shopping carts and suburban indifference, the cruelty escalated. Ethan, emboldened by the lack of evidence against him, began to treat the situation as a badge of honor, a mark of his bad boy reputation. He seemed to revel in the suspicion, the dark glamour of being the main character in the town's tragedy. He would drive slowly past the Blackwood house, his music thumping, a smirk on his face. It was a calculated act of psychological torture, a way of reminding them of his power, of the secret he held. For Chloe, this was a living nightmare. Her silence had become a physical weight, pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. She was terrified of Ethan. She would cross the street to avoid him, her heart pounding whenever she saw his car. But her fear was dwarfed by her guilt. She had seen the fight. She knew how angry he was. She knew he had lied to the police. She had a piece of the puzzle, a piece that might have mattered, and she had kept it to herself. She tried to tell her parents once. She went into the living room where they sat in their customary silence, staring at the wall. "Mum, Dad," she had started, her voice trembling, "about Amelia and Ethan. There's something I saw," but her mother just looked at her with hollow eyes. "Not now, Chloe, please, we can't." Her father didn't even look up. They were so consumed by their own grief, they had no space for hers. They couldn't see that she was drowning right alongside them. The moment passed, and the secret remained locked inside her. The betrayal that cut the deepest, however, came from the town itself. In the beginning, there was an outpouring of support. But as weeks turned into months, and months into a year, the town's sympathy began to curdle into a kind of weary impatience. The yellow ribbons tied around the oak trees faded and grew tattered. The search parties dwindled. People wanted to move on. The constant unresolved tragedy of the missing girl was a pall over their pleasant little lives, and they grew tired of it. They began to whisper that Amelia was wild, that she was probably a runaway, that the Blackwoods were strange, aloof people. It was easier to blame the victim and her grieving family than to confront the terrifying possibility that a killer was living among them. The final brutal humiliation came a year after Amelia's disappearance. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story. Instead of focusing on the unsolved case, it painted a portrait of a troubled girl who had run away from a difficult home life, quoting anonymous friends who suggested she was involved with drugs. The article subtly shifted the blame onto Amelia herself, absolving the town of its responsibility. Reading it, Sarah Blackwood finally broke. That night, she took all of Amelia's canvases, all the vibrant abstract paintings that held the essence of her daughter's soul, and she burned them in a metal trash can in the backyard. Chloe watched from her window, the orange flames reflecting in her tear-filled eyes, as her mother destroyed the last beautiful pieces of her sister. It was an act of ultimate despair, a concession of defeat. If the world was going to erase her daughter, she would do it first. Shortly after, the Blackwoods sold their house and moved away, unable to bear living in a town that had so thoroughly betrayed their daughter's memory. They left without saying goodbye, disappearing as completely as Amelia had. Chloe was sent to live with an aunt in another state. She was adrift, unmoored from everything she had ever known. The guilt and the fear she carried were her only constant companions. She never spoke of what she had seen. The secret was buried so deep, it had become part of her foundation, and Ethan Hayes stayed. He remained in Eagle Creek, a walking, breathing ghost story. He eventually married, had children, and opened his own successful auto repair shop. He became a fixture in the town, a man with a dark past that everyone tacitly agreed to forget. The suspicion that clung to him faded, replaced by the comfortable familiarity of a neighbor, a local business owner. He had won. He had outlasted the grief, the investigation, the suspicion. He had buried the secret, and the town, in its desperate desire for peace, had helped him shovel the dirt. He grew bolder, more confident. The cruelty he had once shown Amelia's father now transformed into the casual arrogance of a man who had gotten away with murder. He was a pillar of a community built on a foundation of lies, his life a monument to an injustice that had been left to fester in the dark. 15 years is a long time to hold your breath. For Chloe, now 29 and living in Portland, the news of the discovery in the Clackamas River was like a sudden, violent exhalation. She was a graphic designer, a job she'd chosen because it allowed her to be creative within a rigid structure, to communicate without having to speak. She lived alone in a small, meticulously neat apartment that overlooked the city. Her life was a carefully constructed fortress against the chaos of her past. She saw it on a local news website. A headline that made her blood run cold: human remains found in Clackamas River may be linked to 15-year-old cold case. The article was vague, citing an anonymous source and a pending investigation. But it mentioned a missing girl from Eagle Creek. It mentioned the name, Amelia Blackwood. Chloe's fortress crumbled. The carefully constructed walls of her life, built brick by brick over 15 years of silence, came crashing down. The guilt she had carried for more than half her life rushed back in, fresh and suffocating. She saw her sister's face, heard Ethan's voice, felt the weight of her own silence. She spent the night on her couch, wrapped in a blanket, shaking. As the ghosts of her past danced in the shadows of her apartment. The next day, Detective Frank Miller's name was in the papers. He had been assigned the newly reopened case. Chloe remembered him. A tired, sad-eyed man who had been kind to her, who had asked her questions she had been too scared to answer truthfully. She knew she had to call him. The thought filled her with a terror so profound it made her physically ill. To speak the secret would be to give it life, to make it real. It would mean confronting not only Ethan, but her own cowardice. For 2 days, she hovered over her phone, her thumb tracing the numbers for the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office. She would type them in, then delete them, her heart pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm. Meanwhile, in Eagle Creek, the news was spreading like wildfire. Ethan Hayes, now a respectable family man, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He saw the news report on the TV at the bar where he was having a beer after work. He watched the grainy aerial drone footage, the reporter said of the riverbank. His riverbank, his face went pale. He left his half-finished beer on the bar and walked out, his mind racing. He had been so careful. He had dug the grave, in the dead of night, in a place he was sure no one would ever find. But the storm. He hadn't counted on the storm. A freak autumn thunderstorm had rolled in that night, turning the river into a raging torrent. When he had gone back the next day, to make sure everything was settled, he had found the grave empty, the earth around it washed away. He had panicked, searching the river for hours, but she was gone. The river had taken her, and for 15 years, he had believed it had hidden his secret forever. He'd convinced himself it was a blessing, a divine intervention that had erased his crime. Now, a goddamn hobbyist with a toy drone had undone it all. His first instinct was to run, but where? He had a wife, 2 kids, a business. His life was here. He had to brazen it out, just like he had before. He would deny everything. It was his word against the ghost. His wife Brenda, a woman who had always chosen to believe the sanitized version of her husband's past, saw the change in him immediately. He became sullen, paranoid, drinking more than usual. He would stare out the window for hours, his jaw clenched. "What is it, Ethan?" she asked one night, as he paced their living room. "Is it about that girl? The one they found?" "It's nothing," he snapped, his voice harsh. "It's got nothing to do with me. It's ancient history." But his eyes betrayed a deep, primal fear. The plot twist, the hidden clue that would unravel everything, was not in a dusty file or a forgotten evidence locker. It was in a box in Chloe's closet, a box labeled Amelia. After her parents had moved, the box, containing the few of Amelia's belongings they hadn't burned, had been sent to her. It held old photographs, a few of her favorite books, her silver crescent moon necklace, which the police had returned to them early on, and, at the very bottom, wrapped in a silk scarf, was her leather-bound journal. Chloe had never been able to bring herself to read it. It felt like a violation, a betrayal of her sister's last remaining secret. But now, with the case reopened and her own conscience screaming at her, she knew she had to. With trembling hands, she opened the box. The smell of old paper and her sister's faint flowery perfume rising up to meet her. She took out the journal. She sat on her floor and began to read. The early entries were full of the youthful angst and artistic dreams she remembered. But, as she got closer to the date of the party, the tone shifted. The entries became darker, more frantic. Amelia's words painted a chilling portrait of a relationship, spiraling into a vortex of control and fear. October 12th. Ethan was waiting for me after school today. He'd seen me talking to Mark from my history class. He didn't say anything, just grabbed my arm and dragged me to his car. He drove for an hour without saying a word, just gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. The silence was worse than the yelling. It was full of everything he wanted to do, everything he wanted to say. When he finally stopped, up on the old logging road, he told me that if he couldn't have me, no one could. He wasn't smiling when he said it. It wasn't a joke. Chloe's blood ran cold. The old logging road, the same area where Leo Davies had found the body. She kept reading, her hands shaking. The final entry was dated the day of the party. It was a confession, a declaration of independence, a final, desperate plea for freedom. October 26th. I have the bus ticket. It's real, it's in my wallet. $184 for a one-way trip to a new life. I'm going to tell him tonight. At the party, I know it's a bad idea. I know he's going to lose it. But I can't live like this anymore. I can't keep pretending. I have to do it face to face. I owe him that. I owe myself that. I feel sick. I feel scared. But I also feel free. For the first time in a long time, I'm packing my bag tonight. I'm putting this journal in it. When I get to New York, I'm going to burn it. I'm going to burn this whole part of my life and start over. I have to believe that's possible. I have to. Chloe dropped the journal as if it had burned her. The bus ticket, the plan to leave, the confrontation. This was the motive. This was the trigger for the explosion she had witnessed in the driveway, magnified 1,000 times. Amelia hadn't just walked off in a huff. She had gone to the party to end it, to break free. And Ethan had made good on his promise. If I can't have you, no one can. The journal was everything. It was the voice of the victim, reaching out across 15 years of silence. It wasn't just a diary. It was a sworn affidavit, a detailed account of the escalating terror that had led to her murder. The stakes had just shifted. This was no longer about Chloe's private guilt or a detective's cold case. This was about to become a public firestorm. She looked at her phone. The number for the sheriff's office was still on the screen. This time, she didn't hesitate. She pressed call. "Detective Miller, please," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "My name is Chloe Blackwood. I'm Amelia Blackwood's sister. I have her journal, and I think I know what happened to her." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. And then, Frank Miller's voice, low and steady. "Where are you, Chloe? Don't move. I'm coming to you." The tension, which had been simmering for 15 years, was about to boil over. The hidden clue had surfaced. The full conspiracy of violence, control, and a town's willful blindness was about to be exposed. Ethan Hayes, comfortable in the life he had built on a foundation of murder, had no idea that the words of his dead girlfriend were about to tear it all down. The fuse had been lit. The explosion was inevitable. The courtroom was packed, a tinderbox of hushed whispers and morbid curiosity. The entire town of Eagle Creek, it seemed, had crammed itself onto the hard wooden benches, their faces a mixture of shock, guilt, and a ghoulish excitement. This wasn't just a trial, it was an exorcism. For 15 years, the ghost of Amelia Blackwood had haunted their small community. And now they were here to watch it either be put to rest or unleashed in its full fury. At the defendant's table sat Ethan Hayes, looking smaller and paler than anyone remembered. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a clammy cornered animal fear. His expensive suit couldn't hide the fact that he was the same greasy-handed mechanic who had terrorized a teenage girl. At the prosecutor's table sat the district attorney, a sharp, ambitious woman named Maria Flores, and next to her, their star witness, sat Chloe Blackwood. She was terrified, her hands clenched in her lap, but as she looked at Ethan, a cold, hard resolve settled over her. This was for Amelia. The key evidence, of course, was the journal. Flores had entered it into evidence, and excerpts had been read aloud. Amelia's own words filling the courtroom with a chilling, posthumous testimony. The defense attorney, a slick, overpaid lawyer from Portland, had tried to have it thrown out as hearsay. But the judge, citing the unique circumstances, had allowed it. The townspeople listened, their faces paling as they heard the story they had all chosen to ignore. The story of a young girl's dawning terror. But the journal, as powerful as it was circumstantial. The defense argued it was just the dramatic writings of a moody teenager. Flores needed something more. She needed to place Ethan at the scene of the crime, not just at the party. She needed to connect him to the grave. And that's where Leo Davies came in. Leo was called to the stand. He was nervous, his palms sweating as he took the oath. He recounted the story of his drone flight, his discovery of the body, and the strange rectangular clearing on the riverbank. The prosecutor displayed the drone footage on a large screen for the jury. The courtroom was silent as they watched. The ghostly image of Amelia's face appeared through the murky water. Several jurors flinched out then. Flores focused on the empty grave. "Mr. Davies," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "You're an expert in aerial photography, are you?" "Not. I'm an experienced hobbyist," Leo corrected. "Ever precise. And in your experience, could that clearing you documented have been caused by natural erosion or animal activity?" "No," Leo said firmly. "The lines were too straight. The corners too perfect. It was man-made. It was a hole that had been dug and then refilled. And based on the age of the vegetation growing over it, it had been there for a very long time." The defense attorney tried to discredit him on cross-examination, painting him as a peeping Tom with a fancy toy. But Leo held his ground, his testimony calm and factual. He was the man who had found the truth, and he delivered it with an unshakable certainty. The cinematic payoff, the moment that would be replayed on the evening news for weeks, came during Chloe's testimony. She had already recounted the story of the fight she had witnessed, her voice trembling but steady. She had read the final damning entry from her sister's journal. The jury was captivated, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity for her and a growing revulsion for Ethan. Now, Flores was leading her towards the climax. "Miss Blackwood," she said gently, "after your sister's disappearance, the police recovered some of her belongings from the area around the party. Among them was her purse. But her journal was not in it, was it?" "No," Chloe said. "She must have taken it out. Or he took it out. And her wallet was in the purse. But something was missing from it." "Correct. Yes. The bus ticket to New York. It was gone." A murmur went through the courtroom. "Now, Miss Blackwood," Flores continued, her voice rising with dramatic intensity, I want to talk about your sister's necklace. The silver crescent moon. It was her favorite, wasn't it? Yes. She never took it off. The police never found that necklace, did they? No, it was gone. Flores walked over to the evidence table and picked up a small, clear plastic bag. She held it up for the jury to see. Inside was a tarnished, mud-caked piece of metal. This was recovered from the silt and debris found with Amelia Blackwood's remains. Flores announced, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom. It was found tangled in her hair. The coroner had to cut it free. She approached the witness stand and placed the bag in front of Chloe. Miss Blackwood, can you identify this item? Chloe looked down. Even through the grime and the tarnish of 15 years in the river, she recognized it instantly. The delicate chain. The crescent moon. But there was something else. A small, deep scratch across the face of the moon. A scratch that hadn't been there before. She remembered it. The fight in the driveway. When Ethan had slammed his fist against the car, Amelia had thrown her hands up to protect her face. His hand, with the heavy silver ring he always wore, had struck her chest, right where the necklace lay. Chloe had seen it. A fleeting, violent impact. Her breath hitched. She looked up, not at Flores, but at the jury. And then, her eyes found Ethan's for the first time. She did not look away. It's her necklace, Chloe said. Her voice filled with a sudden, shocking clarity. And that scratch is from his ring. I saw him do it. The week before she disappeared, he hit her. And his ring scratched her necklace. The courtroom erupted. The defense attorney leaped to his feet, shouting, "Objection! Speculation! The witness is inventing memories." But it was too late. The image was too powerful, too specific. Chloe's testimony was the final, devastating blow. It was the physical proof that connected Ethan's violence directly to Amelia's body. The scratch was his signature, a mark of ownership he had left on his victim in one of his final acts of terror. Ethan Hayes seemed to shrink in his chair, the color draining from his face. He looked at Chloe, and in his eyes, she saw not rage, not denial, but the hollow, empty recognition of defeat. He was looking at the quiet, forgotten little sister who had just sealed his fate, the witness who had finally found her voice. The prosecutor's closing argument was a masterpiece of controlled fury. She wove together the drone footage, the journal, the missing bus ticket, and the scratched necklace into an undeniable narrative of obsession, control, and murder. She painted a picture of a young girl on the verge of escape, and a young man so consumed by his own toxic pride that he would rather kill her than let her go. For 15 years, Flores concluded, her voice dropping to a raw, emotional whisper, Ethan Hayes has walked free. He has built a life, a family, a business, on a foundation of lies, while Amelia Blackwood lay in a cold, watery grave. He counted on the silence of the forest. He counted on the passage of time. He counted on the fear of the witnesses. But he didn't count on a man with a drone. He didn't count on a sister's love. And he didn't count on the fact that the truth, no matter how deep you bury it, will always find its way to the surface. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with tears streaming down her face, could barely speak as she delivered the verdict. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Hayes, guilty. A collective gasp, a sob, a wave of cathartic release swept through the courtroom. Chloe closed her eyes, the single word echoing in the chamber, a final, belated justice for her sister. Ethan Hayes sat frozen, his face ashen, as the deputies moved in to place him in handcuffs. The clicking of the cuffs was the loudest sound in the room, a sharp, metallic finality. The public exposure was complete. The secret was out. The ghost of Eagle Creek had finally been heard. The autumn that followed the trial was quiet and drenched in a soft, melancholy light. The media frenzy had subsided, the news vans had packed up and gone, and the town of Eagle Creek was left to sit with the uncomfortable silence of its own complicity. Ethan Hayes was serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Justice, in its cold, legal sense, had been served. But the emotional echoes of the tragedy lingered. Chloe Blackwood did not stay for the sentencing. She had done what she needed to do. She had given Amelia her voice back. Now, she needed to find her own. She drove back to Portland, but her neat, orderly apartment no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a waiting room. A week after the verdict, she received a package in the mail. It was from Leo Davies. Inside was a framed photograph. It was a stunning aerial shot, taken by his drone, of the Clackamas River. But it wasn't the spot where he had found Amelia. This was a different stretch of water, miles upstream, where the river was wide and calm, bathed in the golden light of a sunrise. The water was like glass, perfectly reflecting the brilliant colors of the autumn leaves on the trees that lined the bank. It was a picture of breathtaking peace, of nature's quiet, enduring beauty. Tucked into the frame was a handwritten note. Chloe, I know that for you, this river will always be a place of pain. I wanted you to have this, to remember that it can also be a place of beauty, that the same water that holds our darkest secrets can also reflect the light. I hope, in time, you can find your own peace. Yours, Leo. Chloe held the photograph, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool glass. It was the kindest, most understanding gesture anyone had ever made towards her. Leo, the stranger who had been drawn into their family's tragedy, was the only one who seemed to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to see things differently. The following weekend, she did something she hadn't done in 15 years. She drove to the coast. She stood on the beach and watched the waves roll in, a force of nature both relentless and cleansing. She thought about her parents. She hadn't spoken to them since before the trial. They had followed the news from a distance, too shattered to attend, too lost in their own 15-year-old grief to be able to support her. She knew she needed to see them. Their family had been blown apart, each of them cast adrift on their own lonely island of pain. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to try and build a bridge. She found them living in a small, grey house in a coastal town, the salt spray from the ocean coating their windows. Her father had retired, and her mother, she learned, had started making pottery again, small, simple things, mugs and bowls. Her hands, it seemed, had finally remembered their old language. Their reunion was awkward and heavy with unspoken words. They sat in a sterile living room, the years of silence, a chasm between them. But as Chloe told them about the trial, about the journal, about the necklace, she saw something shift in their eyes. The hollow, distant grief began to recede, replaced by a raw, present pain. They cried, all three of them. Not the silent, lonely tears they had been crying for years, but shared tears. Tears of loss, of anger, and of a deep, profound regret for the years they had lost. Not just with Amelia, but with each other. It was not a magical fix. The wounds were too deep, the scars too thick. But it was a beginning. A fragile, tentative step out of the darkness. Before she left, her mother took her into the small garage studio. In the center of the room, on a pedestal, was a single, beautiful vase. It was glazed in shades of blue and green, the colors of the river, the colors of the sea. I made this for her, Sarah whispered, her hand hovering over the vase, not quite touching it. For Amelia, it was the first time Chloe had heard her mother say her sister's name in over a decade. On her way home, Chloe felt a sense of quiet purpose. She knew what she had to do. She drove not back to Portland, but east, towards the mountains. She drove up the winding roads, past Eagle Creek, and onto the old, crumbling logging road that Leo had described. She parked her car where he must have parked his. She walked through the woods, the air crisp and smelling of pine and damp earth. She found the spot on the riverbank. The police tape was gone. The clearing where the grave had been was already being reclaimed by nature, ferns and moss softening its harsh rectangular lines. She stood there for a long time, looking at the churning water. This was the place where her sister's life had ended, a place of unimaginable violence and terror. But as she stood there, listening to the rush of the river and the whisper of the wind in the firs, she felt something else, a sense of finality, of peace. Amelia was no longer lost, she was found. Her story had been told. Chloe reached into her bag and pulled out the framed photograph from Leo. She looked from the picture of the peaceful sunlit river to the real turbulent water in front of her. They were the same river, a place of darkness, and a place of light, a place of death, and a place of enduring life. She then took out the small, tarnished silver necklace. She held it in her palm, the crescent moon cool against her skin. This was the last thing her sister had touched, a symbol of both her life and her death. With a final deep breath, she drew her arm back, and with all her strength, she threw the necklace into the center of the river. It flashed once in the afternoon sun, a tiny spark of silver, before being swallowed by the current. It was a release, a letting go. Not of Amelia, but of the pain, the guilt, and the fear. She was leaving it all here, in this place, giving it back to the river that had held it for so long. As she turned to walk away, a glint of light high above the trees caught her eye. She looked up and saw it, a small four-armed drone, hovering against the blue sky, its lens pointed down at the river. It was Leo. He was watching over the place, a silent guardian. He dipped the drone once, in a gesture of acknowledgement, of solidarity, before turning and flying away. Disappearing over the canopy of trees, Chloe smiled. A real, genuine smile. She was not alone. In the shared crucible of this tragedy, she had found an unlikely kinship. She walked back to her car, the weight on her shoulders feeling lighter than it had in 15 years. The emotional echo of what had happened here would always remain, a haunting reminder of the cost of truth. But for the first time, she felt the possibility of a future that was not defined by the past. The reflection in the river had shown them all a terrible truth, but in its aftermath, it had also shown them the surprising, resilient, and quiet beauty of healing.